because I was the only Italian, the other were from Sweden, Finland, and the guy there told me, no, pas possible, un Italien comme ça.
That's just a French word. They like to be offensive. Plus, there is a competition with Italy. We have to bring you down a little bit, especially with wine. We got to say.
Of course.
It's a matter
I was trying to give him satisfaction.
Yeah, you can get us back when we visited Italy.
Anyway, it's a lovely city, actually.
Yeah, no, it's true. It's true.
Wonderful quality of life.
Mm-hmm. Oh, we're very happy here.
Right. I think that's quite a full room and YouTube is working. So I'm happy to make a start. Thanks for joining us, everyone, today. And thank you so much to Professor Cappa, who is our speaker today and was just traveling. So I'm very happy that the timing worked out in the end. Professor Cappa studied medicine at the University of Milan, where he also completed his neurological training, and then had a couple of research stints abroad in Boston at the MIT, the University of California, San Diego, the MSc Hammersmith Hospital in London, and the Max Planck Institute for Cognitive Neuroscience in Leipzig. He was an assistant and associate professor for neurology and neurological rehabilitation at the University of Brescia. And since 1999, he's been a professor of cognitive neuroscience at the San Raffaele University in Milan, Italy, where he's also the director of the neurological department at the hospital. And since 2013, because all of this is not enough yet, he's also a professor of neurology in Vita. I hope I got all of this correct. Didn't miss any of the big stuff.
Well done, Stefano.
Took me a while to remember.
I've been moving a lot.
But it's our great pleasure to have you here today. Thank you so much for following our invitation. And all of you, the talk today is going to be on primary progressive aphasia, a window into language neurobiology. Stefano, if you want to take it away.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to talk about one of my favorite topics. I'll try to convince you that studying primary progressive aphasia is actually quite interesting because it gives you, I've been studying stroke associated aphasia for many years, but that's the title of my talk. I think that primary progressive aphasia provides a complementary and quite different window if you are interested in studying aphasia from the point of view of understanding neurobiology of language, which of course is one of the aims we all have, together from the other point of view, that is getting some insights about the clinical relevance of this condition and the way to manage it. I'm going to focus just on the, of course, on the first part, because there is a lot to say. That is the implication for models of language in the brain. Okay, something usually does not work. Okay, these are my disclosures. Those of you who work in aphasia might have noticed this. There is an overwhelming interest in primary progressive aphasia. If you just type aphasia into PubMed, you get a lot of papers in the last, say, 5 years about primary progressive aphasia, and much less about post-stroke aphasia. This is a very rough estimate, but I just did that in PubMed, and you see, this is 2021, more or less double papers on primary progressive aphasia than post-stroke aphasia, which is quite remarkable considering that primary progressive aphasia is considered as a very rare disorder. Actually, we have no really good epidemiological data. This is a recent study by my friend Giancarlo Logroscino, who's an epidemiologist, who really tried to get some prevalence data in Italy, in Europe actually, by putting together information from this collaboration from several European countries. And as you know, the data come from specialized centers, so they are clearly biased, and it's possible that in many cases actually are not counted here. But as you see, the results replicate the very few findings we have in the literature. That is, if you take frontotemporal dementia, which is the main, even not the unique cause of primary progressive aphasia, the behavioral variant is the most common variety. And the primary progressive aphasia are less frequent. But you see, we are seeing less than one case for 100,000 person years. So it's a rare disease. I must say, probably it's less rare than it might look here, because if people don't recognize it, and in some context, sometimes it's difficult to separate primary progressive aphasia from other forms of progressive neurodegeneration leading to dementia, especially if you see patients in the late stage. Still, a lot of interest for a relatively unusual disease. I would say that if you compare, if you are interested in aphasia, you compare primary progressive aphasia with post-stroke aphasia, the first point to underline is that they are very different from many points of view. Of course, from the point of view of the pathology, from the point of view of the syndromes, and this is the point I'm going to discuss with you today, mostly, because it's a point I'm very interested into also at the sort of theoretical level. They are very different from the point of view of the clinical course, which is also extremely important research-wise, because in one case you have a machinery which is working okay. Some point something happens and the part of the machinery is knocked out, but then the brain tries hard to recover. So an acute event, and then a lot of process of recovery and restitution. While in the case of primary progressive aphasia, you have a very slow onset and a very slow progression. So this gives you a completely different sort of information. That is a sort of graceful degradation of the system rather than a sudden insult. And of course, they are also very different from the points of view of management. Of course, I don't have time to go into this whole array of things. I will focus on the syndromes. Probably I'm pretty sure you all know this paper from by Marilu Gorno-Tempini, which is actually a very important paper because she, for the first time, provided a sort of systematization of the first draft of a classification system. That is, patients have been described, as you know. I'm not going to the history, which is also very interesting, but first by Mesulam, then by other people, Kurtish in particular, Andy Kurtish in Canada, and several other people who described John Hodges, the UK, who found out that this strange clinical phenomenon, which actually had been described in the 19th century by Pick, for example, the first case was actually described by Pick, the Pick of Pick's disease, are not the same. They show very different features from the neurolinguistic standpoint. What Marilu did is to put together a bunch of patients with a diagnosis of primary progressive aphasia. By the way, let me stress this point. In order to say that the patient has primary progressive aphasia, the patient should have primary progressive aphasia. That is, the Mesulam criteria for the diagnosis should be taken as a first step. That is, language disorder should be the most prominent clinical feature, and the only determinant of activity of an impairment in activities of daily life. There are a lot of other conditions, and if you are interested clinically in language disorder, you're going to see a lot of other forms of non-stroke language disorder. But primary progressive aphasia has this specific feature that it starts slowly affecting language and stays like that for a long period of time, ranging from a few years to many, many years. I have patients I've been following for 15 years, and they still come to see me driving their car. They might be completely mute, because this is one of the final outcomes of one form of primary progressive aphasia, but they drive quite proficiently. So this is a very good example of the concept of prominent language disorders with disorder without any other cognitive impairment which affects activities in daily life. So Marie-Lou put together a bunch of patients with this fulfilling this main criterion, and made a systematic study showing with a comprehensive language examination that their profile were quite different. She found that some of these patients had the disorder which had been described by Julie Snowden first, and then John Hodges, that is semantic, what we call now semantic variant. Some patients had a completely different presentation with motor speech impairment and other feature resembling Broca's aphasia, that is anterior forms of vascular aphasia, what we call now the non-fluent agrammatic variety. And then there was a group of patients who did not fit into these two forms which had to have been described before, which we call logopenic aphasia. The terms had been introduced by Curtis a few here before, but to describe a clinical picture which was in some way different, which mainly had anomia and phonological errors. So this was the start of the story. The criteria become codified, and they are based on the typical, so a typical classification scheme as the one developed again in the 19th century for stroke aphasia. That is on the basis of their behavior on language tasks. Verbal behavior, that is connected speech, naming, understanding words, repeating words and sentences, and understanding words and sentences. That is the task you find in a classical aphasia test. You have a list of behavior. Two can be evaluated from connected speech, that is asking the patient, for example, to describe a picture. Two others were finding a word comprehension by picture naming and typically word-to-picture matching. Repetition, including word and sentence repetition, and understanding sentences, including sentences which have a complex grammatical structure. On the basis of the profile of this task, a comprehensive, a sort of, at the time, considered comprehensive system of classification was developed. So this became the classification of primary progressive aphasia. There was three varieties. Let me digress a little bit on the topic of classification. There are many forms of classification. This is actually my favorite. You can read it. It's from Borges, and it indicates that classification is something that our mind and brain likes very much. We tend to classify things to bring order into the external world. And physicians in particular have been always very keen about classification, because classification brings order in the otherwise chaotic world of symptoms and signs of disease. So this, of course, is a an odd classification of, I would say, living things, to use a category which is quite popular in neuropsychology, but it puts together, let's say, it puts together several different criteria. What you like is to have a classification which reflects some theoretical construct. However, classification in aphasia went into the traditional classification, went into a very critical phase. You're all too young probably to remember this, but cognitive neuropsychology was associated with a very strong reaction against classification. The champion of this was Alfonso Caramazza, who basically formulated this sort of ukase against classification. You should never classify, because classification is not only useless, but positively harmful, because patients are all different. Classification is typically made on the basis of shallow phenomena, not on the underlying cognitive mechanism. So it's actually considered to be, it was actually considered time in cognitive, I would say, total win of the field by cognitive neuropsychology as something which, again, was useless, and possibly also harmful for our scientific endeavors. Actually, this is a bit extreme, because if you take the dictionary definition of syndromes, classification are typically based on syndromes. There is one practical meaning of classification of syndromes. That is, you put together symptoms and signs because they tend to co-occur. They happen together. And of course, this might happen for a number of reasons. But what is really interesting and makes, I think, a good classification, Borges' classification was not very good from the point of view. Classification syndromes can be based on a set of concurrent things which allow to identify a pattern. And in the case of medicine, this was very well conceptualized by my friend Giuseppe Vallara a long time ago. You could distinguish an anatomical syndrome from a functional syndromes that, as all of you have mixed bag. But an anatomical syndrome is when, in the case, for example, the aphasia classification, your idea is that the different symptoms, say word finding disturbance and sentence comprehension disturbance, or agrammatism and difficulties of word repetition, might go together just because they are related to locations which are nearby in the brain. And this is actually what I would say most people believe is at the basis of the aphasia syndromes of the classical taxonomy, in which what you see is actually the consequence that the anatomical sampling of the brain that stroke allow is constrained by vascular factors and by the theory of distribution of the arteries. That is, the anterior branches of the middle cerebral artery are the anterior branch of the middle cerebral artery, and their territory happens to be the possible site of a stroke or a thrombotic or embolic, which affects that region. The point I would like to raise here is that I believe that primary progressive aphasia syndromes tend to be much more coherent than the stroke syndromes. This is quite striking in the case of the semantic variant. Also in this case, of course, you have an anatomical sampling. I mean, In this case, it's not the vascular territories, but it's the typical site topography of the neurodegeneration process. And I think this is a key factor. And neurodegenerative disorders are actually characterized by this. Neurodegeneration is a concept which covers our complete ignorance. That is, we say at some point, a part of the brain, which tends to be a system that is an anatomical network which is linked to a function, starts to degenerate. What is really striking in the case of neurodegeneration is you have a whole array of different pathology, usually proteinopathies, right? Abnormal deposition of pathological proteins, huge variety, which tend to have some predilection sites, not absolute, it's only probabilistic. But if you have a deposition of synuclein, it tends to go into a specific portion of the motor system and then to progress in that area and in regions which are connected to that area. If you have Alzheimer's disease, you have another two different types of pathological proteins, but the one which is probably more interesting from this point of view is tau, which tends to start to aggregate and to precipitate in a very, very specific tiny bit of the hippocampus, the transentorhinal cortex, and from there to extend progressively. Look at this other very nice paper from Marilou's group. Giovanni Battistella is the first author of this interesting study, in which basically they compared the meta-analytical area results of language imaging studies with seed-based resting state functional network, and compare them from the point of view of the similarity, topographical similarity, with the pattern of atrophy in the three main variants I described before. That is the semantic variant, the non-fluent variant, and the logopenic variant, the third variety. And as you can see, there is a quite striking pattern of similarity between the task activated areas for speech production, speech perception, semantic memory, and orthography, and the corresponding resting state networks, and a good fit of the non-fluent variant with the first network, that is the one which is associated with speech production, of the semantic variant with the topography of the network associated with semantic memory. The logopenic variety is more complex, as you should see. There is less clustering of the similarity, and as we will see, I'm going too slowly. This comes out from other very different approaches. Then the idea is that I'm not spending a second on this. It's just to show you that this is very complicated. There are a lot of different pathologies, but the proteins, as you can see, are not so many in the frequent varieties, and they tend to share this interesting phenomenon, which is, this has been very much studied for tau, which is the crucial protein for Alzheimer's and for a part of cases of frontotemporal degeneration. They tend to have prion-like spreading, which has been demonstrated. That is, they don't go randomly, but they follow the projection pathways from the topographical sites of predilection. So this is my main idea, that the primary progressive aphasia may represent a sort of possibility to study subcomponents of the large-scale language network, that is, the subcomponents associated with specific partition of language function, which, of course, resemble those which have been defined a priori, but in this case can be sometimes extracted a posteriori from the phenomenon you observe in the primary progressive aphasia. I'm going very fast through some example of the information we got just by studying lesion topography and connectivity in the syndromes. And then I'll show you the results of a sort of totally data-driven transdiagnostic approach that is just starting from the data. Okay, the semantic variant. There are really hundreds of studies of the semantic variant, really hundreds. Why is this so widely studied? Because it gives you a perspective about brain organization of semantics, which was unheard of from the field of stroke aphasia. There are many reasons for that. Reason number one is that the areas which are the focus of neurodegeneration in semantic variant are seldom affected by stroke. Why? Because of their vascular territories. Look at this. Most of the imaging studies I'm showing you, at least those which come from our lab, are based on actually on fluoride desoxyglucose PET, glucose metabolism, because we think that it's actually the best measure of neurodegeneration at the single subject level. So we have been using this systematically. Of course, you can also get very nice information from MRI. You have all measures of structural and functional information from MR. But the structural measures are measures of neurodegeneration. So they are sort of later than the dysfunction shown by FDG PET. And FDG PET is better at the single subject level. So have a look at this series of patients with the semantic variant. Without going into much detail, they look very similar because they are very similar. It's a pathology which has, it's a syndrome which has a very consistent pattern of brain involvement. There is some variation, particularly from the point of view of the right-left. The cases which have aphasia, a language disorder, of course, are overwhelmingly left-sided, but it's a pathology of the temporal lobes, and in particular of the anterior part of the temporal lobes. That is a region which is seldom affected by stroke. There are hemorrhages there, but not so frequent. So the first point is, in this case, the pathology is quite consistent across cases, which is something that doesn't happen often, obviously, in stroke aphasia for obvious reasons. Of course, if you look at the connectivity changes, this is recent work by Cecilia Boccarini, you see a huge reorganization, of course, a loss of hubs, which you can see here, and a lot of changes in connectivity, which usually are considered as compensatory. But again, in this case, you should actually have the possibility to have behavior information at the different stage, which is not the case of this study. But the focus of the neurodegeneration most likely starts in the anterior temporal lobe, and then follows a pattern of progression in the neocortex of the temporal lobe, with extension towards the limbic component, but very unusual towards the hippocampus properly. All these conditions at the end become generalized. But at the beginning, there is this sort of anatomical selectivity. And this can teach you a lot. Studying this patient can teach you a lot about different facets of lexical semantics, for example. A topic we've been very interested into, for example, is abstract words. Because these patients sometimes, not always, because I said there's a lot of consistency, but there is a lot of variation, have an impressive dissociation amount between concrete and abstract knowledge. I won't read all this because it's I'm going too slowly, but basically this guy is a highly intelligent and quite cultivated guy who, as you see, has a very severe young onset form of tauopathy in this case, who had this striking phenomenon. I was using my single word test for concrete semantics, that is showing a picture of a kangaroo. Everybody knows what a kangaroo is. It's because it's a sort of atypical, but it's quite prominent. I mean, everybody has an idea about the kangaroo. And this guy says, yes, I asked him, you can find one of those here in Milan, for example. And he says, yeah, I believe it's domestic. We raise kangaroos here. It's a good business, very useful creatures. Completely lost. I mean, information was animal, possibly pet. Other questions. Can you define what justice is? Well, justice theoretically is the normative principle, the principle that should inform our behavior and our choices. It's one of the basic tenets of society, the distinction between good and evil. Amazing dissociation between concrete and abstract knowledge. Not all patients are like this. We also did some group studies, and what you can see is that while patients with the semantic variant compared to controls, but also compared to Alzheimer's patients, are terrible at explaining the meaning of concrete words. In the case of abstract words, they are often the impaired range, but some patients show a striking difference in comparison with their knowledge about concrete items. Why is this? Well, again, in this case, you can compare the results of what you will learn from functional imaging in normal people. This is a meta-analysis done by Francesca Conca, one of our postdocs, who went through all the literature on huge literature on semantic activation tasks. These are the areas which are involved. Green is the representation area following the proposal by Matt or Ralph. Yellow, the control areas. You see, there are a lot of areas, but the temporal lobe plays a major role, especially on the left. This is another study we did using an adaptation task, again by Francesca, in which we were comparing concrete and abstract specific areas. And as you can see, you find a sort of nice double dissociation with some regions which are shown priming only in the case of concrete words and other in the case of abstract words. So there are two different locations within the temporal lobe. And of course, it's not surprising that you can find dissociation. Depends from the extension of damage and the progression of damaging in this part of the brain, which again, also this kind of evidence indicates that the basis of lexical semantic knowledge on the left. A few words about the logopenic variant. This is another interesting story, because this is the variant in which there is more variety. And again, this might be interesting from the point of view of this idea of the system progression of pathology. This form is typically due to Alzheimer's disease. That is to the form of neurodegeneration, where you find the most extensive degree of variation. That is, the pathology, the tau pathology, in this case, has the progression to take several different pathways. So you find a lot of variation, but you also find, we believe, a sort of relatively consistent core syndrome. Because, I just wanted to show you that you can diagnose logopenic aphasia even in a language you don't know.
Ci sono dei signori seduti su un telo che fanno il picnic. Il signore legge il signore legge un libro. La signora prende, ci sono dei signori.
Okay. You can diagnose logopenic aphasia if you don't, even you don't know Italian, because this is a typical case. As usual, the typical case is not actually so frequent. However, this is the core syndrome. Basically logopenic because it's slow, but the articulation is good. I mean, it doesn't sound like someone who's struggling to speak. But there are a lot of pauses. And then there is this very typical phenomenon, which was described actually in conduction aphasia, the conduite d'approche, that is phonological approximation to the correct word form. So you can say from this that even if you don't understand Italian, this is a phonological disorder rather than a phonetic disorder associated with big problems in producing the word, but not because of the motor speech impairment, but because of phonological programming. Okay. This is a meta-analysis, again, work of Francesca Conca, in which she went through the literature, all the cases which have been described, which of course is a fraction of the cases which are seen, with logopenic, with the diagnosis of logopenic aphasia. And okay, this we don't go into detail with this, but there is a quite consistent syndrome which is characterized by the phonological errors associated with no motor speech impairment, lexical semantic disorders, that is difficulty, lexical disorder rather than semantic, difficulty in accessing the word form, with preserved comprehension and with a deficit of phonological short-term memory. And this is the meta-analysis of the MR data reported in this patient. And as you can see, there is a location of structure of atrophy. These are basically studies of based on voxel-based morphometry or cortical thickness. A damage which is located in the posterior part of the temporal lobe. It's sort of complementary to the anterior pattern of the semantic variant, with variable extension which doesn't come out in the group results in the parietal lobe. That is the area which has been associated on the basis of imaging with imaging in normal people with phonological work-term memory and general phonological processing. And as I said before, this is almost always associated with an Alzheimer's disease pathology. Now you can make the diagnosis in vivo with beta amyloid imaging. I left the non-fluent grammatical variant at the end because I think it's it's one of the, it opens a lot of very important issue in language neurobiology. That is, the possible non-accidental relationship between motor speech and syntactic impairment. These subjects have a prominent disorder in syntactic processing, which is typically associated with the motor speech disorder. We've been using a lot this task, which allows you to test the grammatical competence, even in patients who are very impaired from the point of view of their motor speech production. The task was originally developed by Sandy Weinstein and Marcel Mesulam. You have pictures, and you can play with different forms of a lot of different forms of syntactic complexity. Actually, we have been using this task in different forms, working with the linguist in order to test different form of structures. This is the basic form in which you contrast simple active with the complex active, that is active in which there is an adjunct, typically a relative. We use a relative in Italian, and non-canonical word orders such as passive and objects extracted questions. You show the picture and you give the subject cards with the constituents of the sentence scrambled, and they have to put them in order to produce a sentence which is a faithful verbal description of the picture. If you do this, you see that and you relate this to structural imaging. In this case, it's MR. You see that you get a very, very precise correlation with the Broca's area, bilateral in the case of the total score, and left-sided in the cases of the non-canonical score, in a subcomponent of the anterior insula frontal operculum. It's interesting that if you do cross-linguistic comparisons, you find this sort of trade-off between Italian and English. That is, patient with the non-fluent variety, with the same very comparable extent of brain damage. As you can see, it's typically left inferior frontal gyrus, but also, this is specific in comparison to what you get on structural imaging in stroke cases. There is consistently an atrophy in the medial anterior frontal lobe, which indicates probably the involvement of a complex system for speech production, engaging supplementary motor area, pre-supplementary motor area. These are, by the way, are the parts which are most related to the motor speech disorder. If you compare Italian and English, this is part of a series of studies we are now doing through a large collaboration. People in San Francisco have been putting together. It's the Include network. If you are interested, there is plenty of space for other people to join. The idea is to share data about, it's mostly about neurodegeneration. Language data in different languages, possibly typologically different languages, so that we can do this sort of studies, comparing not only Italian and English, but say what we are doing is English, Italian, and Mandarin, etc. So what you find here, talking about this relationship between motor speech and syntax, is that English is more complex from the point of view of articulation. There are more clusters. Italian is basically CV language with a few clusters. Well, in English, the clusters are many more. On the other hand, Italian is very complex morphologically, as French. German is easier from that point of view. And English is, as someone said, a morphologically poor language of high standing. So it has a very simple morphology. That's the reason why it's becoming language of the world. You see there is a sort of double dissociation. That is, the Italian, with the same lesion site, the English patients have many more distortions than the Italians, while on the other hand, their ability to use complex morphology required to build longer sentences is more preserved than in the case of Italian. So in this case, the same brain networks seem to deal with the language difference with different results. It's a first step in this, but I think it's a very interesting way to go. Okay, I just wanted to show you another approach we have been using in the last few years. This is mainly the work of Eleonora Catricala and other people in the lab. Okay, we've been developing together with our college in the UK a simple, clinically friendly test to study language in neurodegeneration. It's basically a large number of tests with very few items. So you go through many aspects of language processing, but you can do this in half an hour, optimistically. So it's not your typical 3 hours cognitive neuropsychology test that nobody wants to give. What is nice about this study, I must credit Peter Garrett for this idea, is that, of course, you have tasks, but you mostly focus on the errors. So you make the diagnosis, the test. There is now also a computerized version coming out. Gives you a score on the basis of the kind of errors you produce across the tasks. The tasks are the usual, that is connected speech, naming, comprehension, etc. But for each task, you can categorize the errors in different varieties. And we found very useful to, after having tried several classification systems, this very simple one, in which, sorry, I'm trying to close this. Okay. Motor speech, just by listening, phonological errors, semantic errors, syntactic errors, and working memory errors. We found that this is a very important dimensions. And I'm going to skip this. You do something like this. You score the errors across the task. And finally, you get something like this. That is the number of errors which belong to the different categories. And as you can see here, this is the whole sample. And if you have the profiles in the different varieties, they are different. Not surprisingly so. I mean, this is a sort of circular. I mean, the patients are defined on the basis of what they do on the different tasks, but they in this case, it's not the score, but it's the number, the loading of the different error types. This has a big advantage. You have a single matrix with a low number of dimensions, 4 dimensions, because at the end we found that the most discriminating ones were semantic, phonological, syntactic, and working memory errors. On this, Eleonora and her students did a canonical correlation analysis. This is quite complicated. So the paper is out. So if you want to read the painful details, you can go to the paper. But I'm going to give you a very fast overview. Basically, we got 3 roots of the canonical correlation analysis. Basically, canonical correlation analysis tries to put together the behavioral scores and the imaging results. In this case, the imaging results were the principal components of the analysis of the, again, FDG PET. And this goes across all the subjects. And there were three routes which explain most of the variance. The first route is, I would call it the classical route, which compares, which is based on the correlates of, on one side, semantic errors, and on the other side, phonological errors, and goes in the opposite direction. That is, involvement of this part of the brain is related to the number of semantic errors, while preserved metabolism in this part, which as you see is the perisylvian areas, is related to the absence of phonological error. There is an inverse relationship. So this, if you have hypometabolism here, you have a lot of semantic errors, while if the metabolism is preserved here, you don't produce phonological errors. The second route involves syntactic errors and working memory errors. And in this case, you have a complex relationship with the anterior and subcortical areas associated with working memory performance, while the syntactic errors are associated with decrease of metabolism in the left prefrontal areas, including Broca's area. The third route, which is explaining a good proportion of the variance, is actually just related to another component of working memory, that is a component which correlates with the hypometabolism in the temporoparietal areas. That is possibly with the phonological components of working memory. If you look at the results of multidimensional scaling, you have two in which the single dots or squares represent the individual patients, and their distance reflects their similarity. You see that the two variants which are associated with more coherent pattern, that is the semantic pattern and the motor syntactic pattern, form separate clusters, while the logopenic, which as we have seen are associated with different combination with a core, actually overlap, but cut across this continuum. So the idea is that with this kind of approach, you are actually showing what is the multidimensionality of the three variants. And what is interesting is that the mixed case, which are sometimes considered as problematic for the classification, actually fall inside at the periphery of the, let's say, typical profiles. That is, they represent some deviation from what can be considered as core syndromes. I think I'll finish here, and this is the possible conclusion. That is, I think that the syndromes of PPA might be functional rather than anatomical. That is, represent the phenotypic consequences of the progressive neurodegeneration, possibly due to spreading, of putative cognitive system within the large-scale semantic system. The evidence is quite strong for the two variants, which are typically not due to adhesion, while the heterogeneity is larger in the case of the logopenic phonological variant. These are a few of the people who contributed to this. As you can see, we have a huge gender imbalance issue. And I finish here.
Thank you very much. Amazing presentation. I want to give the floor to the others first. So are there questions already? Does everyone dare to come on and ask a question? Not yet. I'm going to let them find the inner strength to raise the hand. So thank you very much for the presentation. I have a couple of questions for you. The first one that comes to mind was when you started showing the maps of the different variants of PPA, the semantic, the logopenic, And one of the common denominators in the PPA literature is the anterior temporal lobe. And you mentioned that we don't pick it up in stroke because you rarely have a stroke there. Now, there recently has been this debate in brain between Marcel Meselam and another group from the US, where they discuss the Wernicke conundrum and the possible explanation that it's not actually the anterior temporal lobe, but the connection that reached the anterior temporal lobe. So I was wondering what you think about it, what your theory about it is.
Yeah, I've been reading this exchange. I must say I find it difficult to follow, because if you if you start from the idea that these systems have some focality, but they are actually distributed, and there is a lot of overlap. I see the differences as you have seen in the last part. I see the differences really graded. I mean, everything happens in the case of, let's start from the assumption that we are seeing system disorders. That is, which is the point I try to advocate. That is, you have Parkinson's disease, which is we used to call an extrapyramidal disorder. This is a disorder of the motor system, which involves a subcomponent which is mostly related to the control of tone and the vigor of the motor activity and its time coordination. Then you have a disorder which is affecting this a part of the motor system. Here we have a disorder which we have an array of disorder due into different pathologies which are affecting the language system. I think this is very important, because first of all, it clearly indicates that there is a language system, which, as you know, is a matter, is in some position a matter of discussion. I think that Evelina Fedorenko made a very good job in delineating this on the basis of functional image. There is a language system, and the language system is not just a byproduct of the activity of other systems. But within this language system, it's clear that we have different subcomponents, but they are not strictly localized. They are different processing streams. So in the case the discussion, the tension of the discussion about the conundrum is actually the role of Wernicke's area. Wernicke's area is in a hub position, which is connected to several components of the network. And as we have seen in the case of the semantic variant, even a disorder which is quite homogeneous, there is a lot of space for variation. I don't think that there is one spot in which the abstract semantic is and another spot in which the concrete semantic is. There are different patterns of connection which possibly push in one direction rather than the other. In the case of words and sentences, it's the same. I think it's the same stories. Probably there are some parts of the system which are more involved at the lexical semantic level, and other parts which are more involved in putting together in the compositional aspects of both syntax and semantics. But the difference is probably graded. So I don't find it compelling to discuss this in terms of different parcels of the cortex. I don't know what you think about it.
Well, I think it's an interesting discussion, and that obviously when we look at symptoms, disorders, and generally the brain, we tend to just look at it in one modality or one method and overlook the relevance of either cortical areas or the relevance of the connection between cortical areas.
Yeah.
Whereas the truth is probably somewhere in the middle. We have some centers in the cortex that are relevant and involved in many dimensions. But we also have the networks without which things like language wouldn't happen in the first place, because those areas are in different lobes.
Yeah, that's the part I didn't show actually because I didn't have time. But we have been looking with FDG at the pattern with different error types across neurodegenerative disorders. Of course, if you put all the stuff together, you get blobs. One part is more related to visual errors. By the way, maybe I can show this slide.
Sure.
Okay, the slide is this one. You can see it?
Yep.
Okay, when Eleonora showed me this, the first time I said, come on, you painted this. Because these are the visual errors, blue are the semantic errors, and red are the lexical phonological errors. This is exactly where I would have drawn them on the template. This was a very large number. Working with errors, what is nice is that you have huge numbers. These were a lot of patients, but we also get a huge number of errors. So you came out with this sort of very nice blobs. But if you look at this is metabolic connectivity. Mm-hmm. And these are the correlation with the changes in connectivity. I mean, the different type of errors are associated with different patterns of decreases and increases of connectivity. Of course, this was within this sort of toy model of the naming system, and then you can find a lot of post-hoc interpretation for these changes, as we did in the paper. But actually, what is relevant is that you get results which are from many points of view similar to the one when you look at cortical overlaps, just looking at connections.
Except that when you look at the figure you showed before, we don't actually need a frontal lobe at all. It's all temporal occipital.
Yeah.
So, like if you ask some neurosurgeons, for example, the inferior frontal gyrus be removed without any long-lasting deficits. And if we look at the figure that you showed before, then that model would also agree that.
Yeah, absolutely. Because I am fully convinced that there are specialization of the different. I mean, this is the cortical anatomy, the clinical anatomy group. When I discuss with people who are not trained in anatomy, I said, well, if the cortex is different, there must be a reason. There must be a reason why the area 44 is different from area 22. I'm pretty sure that there is cortical specialization, but the cortical specialization is very much linked to the connections. So you can look at this from different points of view. I mean, it's not saying that when I said that there is a language system, I'm not saying that within the language system, everything is doing the same computation. Of course, they are doing different computation. I'm just saying that probably the computation are so complex that we don't really, probably mapping the behavior as we do just on one cortical region or on one connection is that there must be a theory in between, a computational theory in between.
Correct. And there's also the mapping problem that we tend to analyze individual linguistic processes and try to map it onto one region or one tract, one-to-one, which may also not be the case.
Yeah.
I can see several hands up. I don't know who was first, but I think it was Lilith. Yes, go for it.
Thank you so much for the presentation. It was really interesting. I have basic question, I think. I don't know, are there, is it possible that there is also involvement of the right temporal lobe in PPA? Is it like atrophy only the left one or the both? And why sometimes it is both then?
No, it's not a naive question. It's very important. Actually, as you might remember from the image of the different cases, the extent of involvement on the right is quite variable. There are different ideas about it. You might have noticed that in some recent imaging literature, there is a sort of let's say much less importance is given to the hemispheric asymmetry than in the past. It's as if hemispheric asymmetry is not fashionable anymore. But actually, I think that this is one of the crucial findings of traditional neuropsychology. The right involvement clearly modulates a lot the clinical picture. In the case of the specific case of the semantic variant, actually there is a syndrome which is associated with prevalent right-sided involvement, which was usually considered as mostly behavioral syndrome. Recently, Marilu Gorno-Tempini and her colleagues have published a paper in Brain, but they have many more data still unpublished, in which what you find is that actually the clinical phenotype is largely behavioral. But if you do sophisticated tests of language involving another aspects of semantic knowledge, which we are studying this a lot recently, that is concepts related to social cognition, say political concepts, concepts related to relationships. I mean, you have words for this. These patients are terrible at this. Basically, as my patient who said that the kangaroo is a pet, they might say that well, justice is a form of friendship, something like this. That is a loss of focus of in the fine semantic distinction. So it's again, why in the world in some patients, if you are unlucky enough to get a genetic predisposition to developing this disease plus some environmental factor, because it's not always genetic, but it's quite frequently genetic. Why in the world, if you have this predisposition to produce a lot of abnormal proteins which precipitate and kill neurons, why in the world in someone this happens on the left, in another it happens on the right, and in another it goes bilaterally? As you might know, Mesulam was the first to propose an idea about this, which is actually a very traditional idea in the medical field. That is, it's the idea that you are born with the components of your physiological system which is weaker because of genetic factor or something which happened during your fetal life or your immediate perinatal life. which might give rise to a developmental disorder, which might be very, very mild. So you at the end, you have a normal development. And then at some point in life, when you have this bad luck, the progression of the pathology, this seeding I've been talking about, goes left because that's the part which is weaker. And in that case, and Mesulam supported this idea with a finding of a history of developmental disabilities, developmental language disorders, which was higher in people who later developed primary progressive aphasia variants. The finding is not so strong. Some people have replicated this. In other samples, it has not been replicated. The genetic results are not really conclusive. But I think this is one of the, I mean, the topography and the hemispheric distribution is one of the big mysteries of neurodegeneration. Many neurodegenerative disorders are asymmetrical, and nobody knows why. But also the anatomy of the brain is asymmetrical to begin with, right? Of course, of course. But you know what? There is not a very good correspondence between the anatomical asymmetry and, let's say, not perfect correspondence. I'm writing a review about this, and I've been checking the pathological literature in the case of Alzheimer's disease, which of course could be the easiest candidate because you get a lot of cases with asymmetry. The relationship with the handedness and the relationship with about which there are several studies, and the relation with the anatomical asymmetries, almost nothing with pathological data. Lot of well, some papers about in vivo asymmetry does not really fit clearly with the phenotypic asymmetry. Even if I must say, I think that this is confounded by the fact that in many cases you find minor asymmetries which are not, I mean, this could be a random effect. While what is probably really interesting is when you have a clear-cut asymmetry. Hmm. So it's a very confusing literature, actually.
Thank you so much. It was interesting.
There's another question in the chat that came through, which is related to multilingualism. And the question is if there's any links between PPA and multilingualism, for example, any effect on the age of onset, speed of progression, etc. Are multilinguals more or less likely to develop certain PPA variants observed or hypothesized?
This is a very good question. I know no systematic studies. I'm saying this, but I don't take any responsibility for this. I've seen a lot of multilingual patients with the primary progressive aphasia. This is purely anecdotal, and this might be biased by the fact that these people are very much aware of their language abilities. But I have seen several multilingual patients who developed the primary progressive aphasia. But of course, this is not a scientifically result. Again, okay, I'm not taking responsibility for what I say, but again, this could be following a sort of Mesulam-like idea. This, you are really taking the system to the limits. And then
I guess going forward, we will see more solid results on this because multilingualism is more and more a topic of research, right? So it will also come in.
Multilingualism is a factor of protection for cognitive decline. And as you know, this is highly controversial, but overall, I would say some people claim that there are many failures of replication, etc. But I think that if in effect is very small, and you have many studies, and several find an effect which is always in one direction, maybe it's there, it's very small. This is, I think this is a different story. But I don't know. There is no evidence about that whatsoever. And the people I've seen were typically people who were spending a lot of time using their different languages. So probably they could notice very early if something was going wrong, because they are putting the system under stress. I mean, one was a professional translator, one was a philosopher who was, you know, this is not, no evidence for that.
Okay, final question, Sabrina.
Okay, well, thank you for this nice talk. I was thinking to your first part of the presentation. So considering the two types, the semantic and the agrammatic type of PPA, what is the most popular type in clinic?
What is the most
popular type of PPA that you find in clinic?
Semantic variant is really rare. It's the most rare of the three. We don't
Absolutely.
have, as I said at the beginning, we don't have good epidemiological data, because in order to get to have a good epidemiological finding, you should have a more careful, let's say, a more linguistically driven evaluation, which is not available in this kind of studies. If you look at the case series from the specialized centers, semantic aphasia tends to be the least frequent of the three. The most frequent is the logopenic variety, which is the one which is associated with Alzheimer's disease, and the one which, by the way, quite often progress to dementia in a few years. So you can observe it as a progressive aphasia just for a few years.
Okay, thank you.
Lovely. I'm aware of the time, so I'm gonna call it the end here. Thank you so much for coming to join us today and the presentation about PPA. Thank you all for joining us this afternoon, and we see you next month again for, no, is it next month? Hang on, I'm making this up. I think we're conferencing next month. Let me double check. We're back no, next month, 28th of June, with Kathy Rockland, and she's going to talk about the histological examples of white matter subcategorization. So see you on the 28th of June next month. Thanks, bye.